Nihilism is a modern way of seeing the world that was singled out as a position you might boldly embrace only in the 19th century. There were nihilists before the 19th century, but in the 1800s, this outlook was much more in the open. And it was then that it was given a name, nihilism. On that name and on what nihilism is, more in a moment. According to Nietzsche scholar Bernard Regenster, nihilism is the central problem of Nietzsche's philosophy. Of the many issues we could discuss that are tied to the locus of this conference, the 19th century, this one, nihilism, is, as I see it, the most related to our current cultural and moral troubles. Both you and I reject nihilism, but we are receptive to a politics that does more than make room for it. Nihilists are people. They deserve a home, but they don't need our home. Yet the entire society capitulates to it, as if only its understanding of an issue like liberty makes sense. The trouble here is that we don't think like the people we actually are. We stop thinking in a manner consistent with our way. We're in the habit of thinking apologetically of our way as something sectarian. This is just our way. There are, of course, many other ways to think. This is our standard mode. No, we stopped thinking in a manner consistent with our way, with rationality. That is, we stopped making sense. This was 40 years ago. We did exactly this. We stopped making sense, and it happened long before the talking heads. Why is an interesting question. But the key thing is to understand what has gone wrong. And that is what we will spend our time on. I'm going to use our time in a way that I think is wise. That is, I'm going to go as slowly as needed to show you the mistake that we've made. And when I say show you, I mean leave you convinced of this, though of course you will be the judge. But I'm going to do all that I can to lay this out clearly so that the error and its absurdity will be quite apparent. Because one of the things depriving us of a good society is this error. It can be corrected. Because the way we have thought is irrational. We can, when we see this, think rationally. Because what we have agreed to is an absurdity. We have to start making sense again. In the summer of 2003, at a conference on the 10 Commandments, that detail is significant, David Bentley Hart delivered a lecture that was published later that fall by First Things under the title, Christ and Nothing. I want to discuss a suggestion that Hart made in that lecture and has made repeatedly since, a claim of such obvious importance that its neglect for now 20 years is starting to look like evidence of brainwashing. Hart's claim was and is that modernity is beholden to nihilism, is fundamentally nihilistic. An insight of Nietzsche, said Hart, that is correct. Nietzsche diagnosed modernity as nihilism and was the first person to grasp this, though, Hart adds, his insight was blunted by a mistake. This is my topic, this diagnosis of our situation. And diagnosis is the right term with all that it implies. I want to expose the trouble, which is that most people are not born nihilists and are probably inclined quite differently, but they're turned into nihilists in a society structured by conclusions of nihilism, or turned at least into true builders and defenders of a nihilist society without ever taking a position on the issues that make a person a nihilist. I'll note these in a moment. So without ever answering the question at all that the nihilist answers in the negative, people in our society become fellow travelers, creating the society that fits and indeed implements nihilism, according to the vision of society meaningful to a nihilist, not a society aligned with what they themselves might actually believe. Indeed, the world they have pitched in to build actively suppresses efforts to live by the traditional outlook. And this is done by teaching people freedom. That is, the meaning of freedom in our world is freedom as the card-carrying nihilist sees it. This is Hart's claim, and it's my objective to show you that that is so. I really have to repeat that for the idea to be clear. I have to make a distinction between two different things that we could refer to as our view of freedom. The first is the view that came from our Western tradition and fits what we as Christians most deeply believe. But there is also the view we today hold about freedom, and this too is our view of freedom. Our proper view versus the view we espouse, accept, trade in. The two may not match. For instance, were you to hear a lecture by an American historian and hear him say that we today are careless in our talk of freedom, we do not define freedom. We use it, and it's a loaded word for which people live and die. So I'm going to define it for you. After mentioning two kinds, national and political freedom, he notes the third kind. That is the freedom to live as you choose as long as you harm no one else. That's what the founders of our country meant when they spoke of freedom time and time again. If, hearing that, you agree and carry on, if this strikes you as true, that is what the American founders meant, then you espouse, as I was saying, the view of freedom of our time, not of your own outlook. Professor Fears is right that we are using a word loaded with a definition, whether we think it is loaded or not. Freedom long predates nihilism. It has a meaning that belongs to what you and I, as Christians, call our tradition. But that meaning has been replaced. The idea of freedom has been given a new content, a meaning that is compatible with nihilism alone. It is as if the two outlooks, nihilism and what it replaces, had a war, and nihilism won, and then had its understanding of ideas central to our world, ideas like freedom, embodied in all our institutions, from schools to marriage to the laws on our books. Again, that is my claim, and this claim raises a problem for my account, because it is possible that you will not believe me. We tend to hold the view that the fair understanding of liberty that we have today has involved a slight alteration, a sidelining of moral concerns as a requirement of the advance of liberty. That, however, was a trick. How can it be a requirement of liberty to change its own meaning? What took place was not a deeper look into the true implications of liberty, thanks to which we dialed something down to avoid violating our own principles. What took place was the replacement of one conception of freedom with another. And so I have to explain to you how that could be. Truly, how could the idea of freedom that we care so much about be translated into a kind of antithetical understanding of freedom right under our noses? You will see that the two conceptions of freedom are antithetical. So I have several things to explain, and these are the four divisions of my presentation. What nihilism is, what the two views of freedom are, the nihilistic one that is actually current, and our view, that is the view that fits our actual beliefs as Christians, which the nihilistic one has replaced. And then once you see the difference, show you how such a replacement could occur, show you the nihilism in modern freedom. You will see very clearly that the meaning of freedom was changed, and not in a subtle or nuanced way. We get into arguments over freedom in which people will say, oh, but I'm not a liberal. I'm a classical liberal. I accept the more nuanced view of freedom that animated the American founders. And Canada, by the way, in the freedom it upheld in its move to Confederation, appears to have followed quite consciously in the Americans' footsteps. The institutions of the United States have the same features with our own. The same great principle is the basis of both, that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are the unalienable rights of man. So in the images I'm showing, I'm speaking of both Canada and the United States, not one more than the other. But again, in words you might be given about the more nuanced view of freedom that animated the founders, what that nuanced view is, you are never told. Nor will you be told which theorists laid it out, so you could go read up on what the classical liberal view of freedom actually is. No so-called classical liberal of our day will ever tell you. It won't be Locke, because Locke still endorses the traditional understanding of freedom. He will make a traditional argument, you'll see what that is later, to prevent someone from doing a thing that today that person would claim a right to, a thing that the classical liberal here will step up to defend his right to do. Again, I'm talking about the meaning and nature of freedom. The 10 principles of classical liberalism give you the principles that guide the classical liberal to what he calls freedom, but they do not tell you what freedom is. To learn liberty is to learn how to secure the thing that he calls freedom. And this freedom is a quite particular thing. And none of the 10 principles explains why he defines it this way. In fact, an expression like individual autonomy is telling you that freedom should be individual. Well, what first is freedom? And why, reasons, does it matter? It is a whole other step to go from freedom, whatever it might be, to individual freedom. Just what are we told about freedom itself? The shift in meaning from the truly classical conception of freedom, which you will see is ancient, to the modern conception of freedom held by the so-called classical liberal is what I will lay out. You will see that it is not a subtle shift. Freedom has a profoundly different substance in the two outlooks, and that the shift involved a pivot on one issue, the issue alluded to earlier by Nietzsche. The modern notion of freedom arises by rejecting the framework that in the ancient world gives freedom its substance and importance. That framework is not Christianity. It is a thing even pagans could formulate. Modern freedom arises by rejecting what gives freedom its actual sense. Not discrediting that framework, but rejecting it without explanation. This is its nihilism. Yet, ironically, modern talk of freedom succeeds in being very persuasive to Christians. What passes today for the moderate, entirely reasonable updating of liberty that is required by liberty is deeply at odds with freedom as it was understood in the West. Freedom as it was understood into the time of Locke and the founders. You will see that the difference is clear, unambiguous, and very profound. Dare I say that you will see this? I think so, because I'm going to make you pay the price. Patience. We will take the steps. It's like climbing a tall hill. We have to take all the steps that get us to the top. And then we can have the prospect, and it will be worth it. But I expect you can see the problem I've mentioned. If the shift in meaning is as drastic as I'm saying it is, how could this swapping of one conception for another have happened? That we have accepted the new understanding, that is perfectly clear. As Hart explains, we live in an age whose chief moral value has been determined by overwhelming consensus to be the absolute liberty of personal volition, the power of each of us to choose what he or she believes, wants, needs, or must possess. This is not, and you will see why, our proper conception of freedom. Indeed, it is not even a rational conception. Nevertheless, today, among liberals, Christians, conservatives, our culturally most persuasive models of human freedom are unambiguously voluntarist. And this is the highest good. I'm pointing to an absurdity that we have accepted, the installation of nihilism in the concept most central to our way of life, with the deterioration of society that guarantees, a decay you are not permitted to intervene in so as to limit, which would involve the violation of our chief moral value, which is the guarantee of freedom. And that being the thesis, the question dogging what I have to say is, how could we have accepted an absurdity? This might well make you resistant to my claim, which is that unsuspectingly and without being nihilists, we have gone over to nihilism in the terms of freedom that we accept. This is going to seem quite implausible. And before I turn to nihilism, I want to bring out right at the start a weakness in what may be your assumption that no such change could ever get past us. Writing about nihilism, the philosopher Martin Heidegger wrote, "Not everyone who appeals to his Christian faith or to some metaphysical conviction or other stands on that account definitely outside nihilism. It is actually hard to have an accurate sense of who we are, of where our weaknesses lie. Central to what I'm talking about, as I've said, is the deterioration of society that results from the very replacement I've just named. Not very long ago, a good reminder of this came across my screen. This person writes, "In the name of freedom, we built a society that separated sex from responsibility. The result? A collapsing birth rate. Is this not true? For what were all those children who were not had to obtain? What was the fruit obtained instead? In our tradition, there is fruit of virtue and also fruit of vice. The black fruit of vice. One of the great sins is overindulgence in pleasure. Another is the desire to avoid responsibility. The moral decay of society that we all know so much about, where a life whom you would have the honor to know is traded for what is as infinitely forgettable as the time at the beach. And this is hawked to all on national billboards like magazines. This collapse of a civilization, if that is what it is, has no adequate explanation if it was not made possible by Christians, who, as this was all happening, were the dominant group, the West. The West is the agent of a decay that we have a tendency to misdescribe. The narrative of traitors in our midst who secretly undermine the traditional order is not, in fact, a very plausible story. That the mainstream of society was induced for reasons of its own to set up idols in the temple, to accept something exactly contrary to its own tradition, has far more plausibility than we tend to think. So it is a part of this story to ask how it was possible to make this transition, the one I must first show you took place. We have to be much more aware of how the ideals of a civilization could be perverted, and by whom. We tend to imagine that we understand the mechanisms of cultural decay, that we know where the cultural decay that is rife in our age comes from. A tremendous amount has been written about it. Nietzsche already identifying decadence in the 19th century, which he saw as things let go of. He attacked the attraction to release, laisser-aller, which meant unconstrained freedom, which was releasing a real human plunge into appalling anti-life habits, he said. He expended a lot of mental energy on identifying the origin of this decay. He found these instincts of decadence in Christianity. But our answer is scarcely more sophisticated. It is simply barbarians, an anti-culture keen to destroy. The two penultimate sentences of Alistair MacIntyre's After Virtue, which I believe we have misread, are, this time, the barbarians are not waiting beyond the frontiers. They have already been governing us for quite some time. And it is our lack of consciousness of this that constitutes part of our predicament. MacIntyre was writing a decade after Carl Henry, whose 1969 address to the graduates of a Baptist seminary was titled, "The Barbarians Are Coming." It became the opening chapter of Twilight of a Great Civilization. A half generation ago, he wrote, the pagans were still largely threatening at the gates of Western culture. Now the barbarians are plunging into the mainstream. What caused the decline of Western thought and culture? What turned America into Gomorrah? What did such radical damage? In short, our answer is them. Radicals, barbarians, people completely unlike us. It is as if the prodigal son of the parable has gone off into a far country, in our home, and ruined our home with his reckless and degenerate ways. A home with us in it. To listen to us, it is he who was responsible for what has happened. Well, we've got to think this through. This answer, though, comes with its own special puzzle. It hands us a distinct question, though people seem not to notice this. No Roman ever looked at a barbarian without getting instant confirmation that this is not a Roman. This character is not one of us. The very term barbarian fastens on that very thing. It is a Greek word, an onomatopoeic word, that said, these are people who don't speak Greek, but just say bar, bar, bar. The Greek or the Roman was right to think instantly that this was a person from somewhere beyond the frontier. None of that is true for us. None of what defined the literal barbarian, being from somewhere else, not speaking our language, not being one of us, applies in the story of the last 200, 300, 400 years. Applies in the modern West, in the era of our civilizational collapse, or whatever the more accurate term for that might be. I'm not against the barbarian motif. I have used it myself. But if this is our way of understanding something, then we should make our meaning quite clear. And to do that, ask all the attendant questions. Did we not generate our own so-called barbarians? Are they not Western and modern like us? Don't we all speak the same language, the language of modernity? The barbarian analogy treats the West very implausibly, in my view, as a patient, as an entity to which something happened, upon whom something has descended from outside it. That is a picture to which a serious adjustment is called for. Our culture was not attacked by barbarians. The nihilists were there within it from the beginning. Jesus even conceived a parable about one. What happened instead is that the maintainers of the tradition ceased to maintain it. A tradition might contain all the principles a person could dream of, but being principles, they require minds to inhabit so that they can be deployed as barriers against completely foreign proposals. Proposals such as the plan to install an idol in the temple. The West is the agent of a trouble that we are misdescribing as a conquest. We are telling the wrong story. There were never barbarians, outsiders, not in modernity. We put an idol in the temple, as Solomon did, because we did not maintain the rational understanding of freedom that was ours. That is our story. The narrative of traitors in our midst turns out to be a very convenient obfuscation It is a jarringly familiar tactic. She is to blame. And regarding solutions, here's my point. On the issue of decay, we are accepting a very bad role for ourselves. So long as culturally we behave in any way like the alcoholic whose trouble is caused by other people. There's no doubt he has such trouble. They may be alcoholics too. But his chosen role is to console himself with drink. The situation cannot change, as he is by no means a bit player here, if this is his thinking. But if we are to be faithful, to do as we are indeed commanded to do, and that is to proclaim liberty and seek justice, then the situation must be corrected, our grasp of it changed. Could the decay that we call barbaric be the West's own nihilism? The West is genuflecting to what Nietzsche called the nothing. It has bowed down to nothingness in its acceptance of a conception of freedom that is contrary to what a large proportion of the population believes about reality. In its institutions, the modern West reserves a special hallowed place for the reign of nothingness. As I want now to show you that that has happened, and to some degree how. If I can do that, you will have to reflect on why it happened. Was it because we wouldn't defend our own beliefs? Because we were embarrassed by the smear? When the traditional position was called authoritarian, not freedom-loving, did we want to be seen as defenders of coercion? So then we bit and became instead defenders of freedom by the new definition. Is that it? Did people drop the classical view of freedom because of the slur instead of just saying, you're offended at my fascism? Well, you're way off, but call it as you see it. If I look bad to you, what can I do about it? Does it really cost us to say, be offended? You won't get me apologizing for nothing, doing your propaganda dirty work for you. As for today, it looks to me like all of society now does that dirty work in all of our institutions, laws, courts, school, marriage, right or left, it makes no difference. It is nihilist expositions that teach what freedom is. And it is with that understanding of freedom, cleansed of what marks the traditional view, sets in motion, that generates all the refuse of modern culture. For instance, the banality, conformity, and self-indulgence of modern mass culture, as Hart put it in his lecture. Practically, our whole culture might be a culture of nihilism. My plan now, at last, is to explain what it means to say that anything is nihilistic. What is nihilism? I'm inclined to give it a small n because it is not a movement, it is an outlook that only in the 19th century took on this name, but because it has genuine and clear positions, it certainly deserves the capital. Unfortunately, there are two completely contrary and at the same time legitimate meanings of this one term, nihilism, and I need to get one of them out of our way, it being off our topic. Here is the one that we are going to look at. What nihilism is, in a technical sense, is the rejection of any sort of objective truth, meaning, or value, independent of the self or the world. It is a condition of conscious disenchantment in which every metaphysical discourse and every religious claim has been abandoned. Why the concept of nothing in this term? Nihil being the Latin word for nothing. Unfortunately, even reputable philosophers appear not to understand this. By the way, just to spare you agonizing over this, it can be nihilism if you're imitating the Latin, or nihilism if you're going with English, as in annihilate. Just pick one without apology. The Oxford Dictionary of Philosophy prepared by a reputable philosopher, gives the meaning I am not going to discuss. Nihilism is the theory promoting the state of believing in nothing, or of having no allegiances and no purposes. Whether it is even possible to be or to decay into such a person, it is certainly possible to have a theory that you can have no allegiances. So this is a legitimate meaning. I suppose we need such a term. Unfortunately, this has nothing to do with the actual use of the term in the 19th century, when nihilism, used in a sense quite opposed to this, had a new and considerable influence. And what is weird and even ridiculous is that that actual historical use is the usage that Simon Blackburn tries to put a stop to in his dictionary. The Oxford Dictionary entry continues, it reads next, and laughably, the term is incorrectly used to characterize all persons not sharing some particular faith or particular set of absolute value. The dictionary prose employed here, unfortunately, obscures Blackburn's actual meaning. If the norms of diction had allowed it, Blackburn would have written, don't you dare call another person's views nihilistic just because they're not your oh so special values. That is exactly what that line says, under the skin. Well, sorry, Professor Schoolmarm, but you seem not to know the chief thing about the origin of this term in the 19th century. That is, Blackburn doesn't seem to know the answer to the question I asked a moment ago, why the concept of nothing that is plainly in this term. He thinks that the nothing in nihilism is an expression of disapproval. You people with no faith, no belief in absolutes. Blackburn, by the way, has told us that he is such a person. So he is sensitive to this. You people believe in nothing. Well, that's not where it comes from. That's not the story. The implicit nothing in the word nihilism is not a slur hurled at the nihilist by, say, the 19th century Christian. It is the nihilist's own description of himself. As Hart said, nihilism is a condition of conscious disenchantment. It names the outlook of a person who says there's nothing outside the material world, or nothing outside what man decrees. There's no outside point of reference, no law in the order of things that was not put there by man, no star by which to reckon in any absolute sense, no absolutes, no absolute values. You just heard the repetition of the word no from the lips, as it were, of a nihilist. That is the nihil in nihilism. It's really perfectly clear that the nihilist is not saying that he doesn't believe in anything. He's saying he doesn't believe in anything like that. When the term nihilism was popularized in the 19th century, that is the way it was used. And this happened even before Nietzsche wrote about it. People have said it was coined by the Russian novelist Turgenev. Apparently, though, a student of Kant came up with it. But Turgenev, who lived half his life in Western Europe, certainly popularized it in his most famous novel, Fathers and Sons, written in 1861. Speaking about the main character in this novel, named Bazarov, whom Turgenev modeled on a young doctor he had encountered on a Russian train. In the novel, Bazarov's friend says, he's a nihilist. A nihilist? That comes from the Latin nihil, nothing, I imagine. The term must signify a man who recognizes nothing, who looks at everything critically. A nihilist is a person who does not take any principle for granted, however much that principle may be revered. The issue here is recognition of absolutes. When another character objects, but doesn't the logic of history demand, Bazarov interrupts to say, what has logic to do with us? We can get along without that too. What do you mean? Just that. You don't need logic, I suppose, to put a piece of bread in your mouth when you're hungry. We've no time for such abstractions. Or at another moment, well, well, said Bazarov calmly, what noble-minded fellows we are. So you still attach importance to marriage. I didn't expect that from you. A friend of Bazarov says, "When I heard him say for the first time that we should not accept any species of authority, I was bowled over with enthusiasm. My eyes were opened." Bazarov is training as a doctor. He does experiments to see how things work. We have seen how he values what is useful. So, first point, in no way do the nihilists, whom we will look at, believe in nothing. Yet they might, like the author of this book published in 2007, reject the entire plan of calling yourself something. The publisher notes, the author describes her struggle to find out what kind of something she really is. In the end, she finds that nothing is a philosophy to be embraced rather than feared. She isn't anything. The issue, that is not simply the inability to find something to identify with, but complete disbelief in that project. In a quite similar way, Bazarov answers when asked, "So you only believe in science? I've already explained to you that I don't believe in anything." And what is science? Science in the abstract. There are sciences, as there are trades and professions, but abstract science just doesn't exist. Again, he exclaims, aristocratism, liberalism, progress, principles, think of it. What a lot of foreign and useless words. There are unreal things, so you certainly cannot believe in them. And then there are real things, and these are not things to believe in. They're things to do or to use. Nature, Bazarov says, is not a temple, just a toolbox. A nihilist, then, is not a person who has, as Blackburn put it, no purposes. There are many things to do and to believe in doing when you give up belief in a transcendent reality. And second point, again, contra Professor Blackburn, nihilism has this technical sense of the repudiation of authority, of absolutes thought of as dictating to us what we should do, any sort of direction outside a person's own will. And this use of the term carries no implication of disapproval. It's irresistible, mind you, for people who have undergone no such disenchantment themselves, to take the nihilist's own term for himself and bash him over the head with it, saying, what you find people have wound up believing in is bash, nothing, just as you say. But that is a piece of rhetoric. That is what other people think. And what I mean to look at is the thinking of the nihilist. That nihilism seems entirely a negative outlook. A rejection, however, is only an appearance. Disbelief in something means belief in, or if you prefer, acceptance of something else. And we will be lost on this topic if we do not see this. The clearest indication of the new belief that is central to nihilism, you could in fact just forget the label nihilism altogether and think simply about this. Was set out by Nietzsche. The central issue is authority. Where does it lie? We used to believe that we were taking direction from an order outside us, but there are no instructions in the universe. It lies inescapably in us. We are the decider. We can pretend to answer to an authority, but we have picked that authority. The nihilistic question, for what, is rooted in the old habit of supposing that the goal must be demanded from outside by some superhuman authority. Having unlearned faith in that, one still follows the old habit and seeks another authority that can speak unconditionally and command goals and tasks. Here, Nietzsche is observing that people have trouble accepting that they have no master. They want, it seems, to be commanded. But once a person has at last understood that there's nothing requiring her to heed any command, that to obey, you must agree to obey, then the illusion is shattered, he claims. In the position of authority, there's really just you. This is what nihilism is really about, which you can see is misnamed around its negativity. Half the picture is missing. Having unlearned faith in superhuman authority, we're now going to give up the old habit, says Nietzsche, of looking for something by which to legitimate what we do. Now we will drop the illusion and just be. Let ourselves love what we love. Be, not who we already are, but be. Make ourselves into something. Losing belief in one thing leaves us believing in the actually driving thing, the thing within ourselves that we now accept has been directing everything. Living free of this illusion, under our own authority, this is what nihilism is about. But really, the very idea of authority is gone. It is not that we have authority. There's no right of direction at all. There's just the will, autonomy. What moves the human world is the self acting according to its own law, its own most fundamental commitment, the law it gives itself. This is Rousseau, who understood legitimate law as law that comes from you, as he put it, the law one has prescribed for oneself. Now, if this is what the negative impulse of nihilism leads us to positively, it would be quite reasonable to think that there is also a positive name for nihilism, related to what the nihilist believes in. We have already discussed what it is the nihilist rejects, but I've just explained that he also believes in something. What is the name for it? What word captures what I've just said? The new principle that this outlook is all about, in that having rejected the authority that he or she considers illusory, the nihilist now plans to live under her own authority. What is the positive name for this way of living? Obedience to the law one has prescribed for oneself is liberty. The name is freedom. Freedom is the word that announces this new order of fidelity to whatever is actually driving people, the self-moving of their own will. You could propose to call it life, but is there a vision of life that is driving action here? No. The common thing is the inner voice in each person that is charting for itself a way of living. But this way of living is not at all common, nor does it even remain the same for each person. This picture of life differs from one person to another, and it is in flux, changing in time for each person, in obedience to that inner voice. The general term that governs this, the thing that people can push for together, is freedom. For what is freedom? That one has the will to self-responsibility. Freedom is the word that captures the positive essence of what arose with the name of nihilism. Now, this ought immediately to stun you. The rise of nihilism, which is the rejection of the transcendent order. There is no natural law, no moral order, no God to direct us from on high, is the rise of a demand for freedom. It is freedom, in this very sense of individual autonomy, that is the positive reality motivating nihilism. Now, suppose you were to notice this historical situation in which there is a rise of nihilism, a rejection of the very notion of transcendent good, but within a culture builds on the notion of a transcendent order, which draws man to life according to its direction, the direction of that order. Suppose a person were to register this and say, oh, two different cultures, and they are different, no? Two cultures both united in the pursuit of freedom. Great. These two cultures will pool their efforts in a great advance of freedom. What would you say to such a person? Well, that's more or less, in effect, what the culture as a whole said. Great. Let's all advance freedom. And what was the result? It is the nihilist culture that was built, bringing Western civilization to a condition of ruin. We seem not to understand that freedom, by which I mean that entirely absurd misconception which I just sketched, the great common project of freedom, was the mechanism of the overthrow of Western culture that I just mentioned and alluded to earlier. And there's so much more that we could add. What has covered up the actual nihilism of advancing modernity, making the mechanism of this collapse completely invisible, is the centrality to modernity of freedom. And before I turn to how this overthrow occurred, I want just briefly to underline one thing. The rightful place in modernity of freedom. Take note of something in Western history that bears on what we are examining. In another lecture, Hart brought up the question of why Christianity over the centuries has given rise to a culture capable of the most militant atheism and self-conscious nihilism. There's no desire to provoke here, I think. This is the statement of a fact. Where else has atheism, militant secularism, the disdain for long-settled ideals, and even for holding anything like ideals, where else but in Christian nations did these things bloom, as in virtual greenhouse conditions? If you attempt in your head to explain this fact of history, you might well find yourself counting it a plus, calling up the key concepts of the actual argument, the actual explanation for this freedom, as part of a decidedly Christian project. Who gave us liberty? From whose worldview does it come? Liberty, a gift of God, a gift that the recognition of others, even those unlike us, requires us to recognize. Hart lays it out very well. Modernity was or is a kind of cultural project that understands itself as the history of freedom. The project that is the one grand cultural and historical narrative that we as modern persons share. The story that most sharply distinguishes a modern from a pre-modern vision of society is the story of liberation, the story of the ascent of the individual out of the shadows of hierarchy and subsidiary identity into the light of full recognition, dignity, and autonomy. Well, now we have the last piece of the thesis. That thesis being that the modern notion of freedom is essentially nihilistic, using the word in its technical, not polemical sense. I said that modernity has nihilism in it. It is present in the modern understanding of freedom. What has somehow covered up the actual nihilism of the shift to modernity is the fact that nihilism is a kind of liberty. The word kind ought to offer sufficient warning of the sort that prompts the question, genuine liberty? But it would seem that the issue of kinds was almost never raised. Why not just suppose that freedom is freedom? There is, after all, something in us that responds to this kind of, I was going to say logic, but plainly it is not an argument. There's something about the simplicity of the assertion that marriage is marriage and freedom is freedom that attracts people to accept this simply, without thinking any further. But given the fact that freedom for the nihilist lacks any connection with transcendence, there's nothing transcendent there that the nihilist could link it to, and that freedom for the traditionalist possesses such a connection, gets its meaning from this connection, we have two things with the same name. Freedom, as it is understood by a nihilist, can certainly be called freedom, but it is not at all the same thing as freedom as it is understood by a person who inhabits a divine order. For one thing, they serve different purposes, and not just different purposes, entirely opposed ones. But, and here's the absurdity, the freedom that came to prevail in modernity as our chief moral value, said Hart, is essentially nihilistic. The question is, why did our commitment to freedom commit us all to this? That is the great puzzle. Most people of the 19th and 20th centuries are not people like Bazarov. They have not come to the conclusion that there is nothing in the order of things to recognize, that there is no species of authority but that in our own souls. They have not even asked the question, do I believe in a moral order that is given to me that I do not give myself? In fact, they're inclined to behave like they do recognize this order, at least in some areas, while being disinclined to explore this very much, because it can only get in the way of their quite natural inclination to behave as if the great will in charge of their lives is, in fact, their own. But most people on either side of this divide have a conception of freedom that makes sense only if they are nihilists. Further, in embracing this nihilistic conception and so delivering what freedom, in that sense, is made to deliver, they call forth from society the fruit of nihilism. Wherever there is a shift to modernity, certain pre-modern ways, traditional ways, are counted deficient. Their fruit either comes at too high a price, denying freedom, or is actually evil. Modernity judges the figs by its criteria. And one such shift involved the re-understanding of freedom. For the nihilists, the old way of thinking had that sort of defect. But the strange thing is that it was upholders of the old way, of the pre-modern view, who were persuaded to endorse the rejection. Whether the modern notion of freedom is essentially nihilistic, whether such a shift in the very conception of freedom has in fact occurred, is what I aim to settle in your mind. The time that we have available today and on Wednesday is, I think, just time enough for this.